The Rainbow Goblins by Rico, a close reading by Amanda Hull. Once there was a land that lived in fear of 7 goblins. They were called the Rainbow Goblins, and each had his own color, which was also his name. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Yellow, being the craftiest, was their chief. The goblins lived on color. They prowled the valleys and climbed the highest mountains looking for rainbows, and when they found one, they caught it with their lassos, sucked the colors out of it, and filled their bellies with the bright liquid. Only one place in the land had never known goblin fear, the hidden valley called the Valley of the Rainbow, where the great arches of color were born. There the animals still lived in paradise. But the rainbow goblins had heard tales of this valley, and their mouths watered whenever they thought of the feast that awaited them there. And so they gathered up their lassos and their pails and set off. With great effort, the goblins made their way over the jagged piles of rock that guarded the entrance. When the climbing became difficult, Yellow roared, "Don't lose heart, comrades! Think of the delicious colors ahead!" The sun had almost set by the time they reached their goal, the very meadow where the rainbows sprang to life. Immediately beneath the meadow they found a cave. "We'll spend the night here," the yellow goblin commanded. When the moon rose and saw them warming themselves around the fire they had lit, it shouted out in alarm, "The rainbow goblins are in the valley!" And the trees and the bushes took up the cry, and the flowers and the grasses and the animals and the waters passed it on, and by midnight the evil tidings had spread throughout the valley. The goblins could hardly contain their excitement. "Soon all the colors of the rainbow will be ours," Yellow gloated. "We'll snatch it as it rises," said Green, "when the colors are still fresh and creamy." The blue goblin cackled. "Look at the roots dangling from the walls. They're straining to hear our plans. A lot of good it will do them or their friend the rainbow." Finally exhausted by their scheming, the goblins fell asleep. Outside, the moon shone on the mirror-like surface of the water, and its magical light was reflected into the cave. Then all 7 goblins had a wonderful dream, the same wonderful dream about the paradise of Rainbowland, where all they had to do was lie on their back and open their mouth, and the most succulent colors dripped down their throats. The dream went on and on. The greedy goblins drank and drank, and at dawn, just as their bellies were about to burst, they were awakened by the distant clap of thunder. The goblins sprang to their feet and rushed to the mouth of the cave. "A storm! A storm!" Red shouted. "Look how the wind is driving it towards us!" Orange cried. And all the goblins danced and pranced about with glee, for they knew that after the wildest morning thunderstorm comes the most beautiful rainbow. Yellow was so proud of his plan of attack that he went over it again while each goblin tested his lasso. "Red, don't forget that you must seize the left flank." "And I move to the right," the violet goblin burst out excitedly. Before the last roll of thunder had faded from the valley, the goblins took up their pails and lassos and marched single file out of the cave. The sight that greeted them when they reached the meadow took their breath away. The rising arch of the rainbow, so rich with color and promise, almost blinded them. Trembling with excitement, Yellow finally managed to give the signal to attack. The goblins swung their lassos around and around and hurled them into the sky. But in that same instant, the rainbow vanished as if it had been swallowed up by the earth. The goblins were dumbfounded. Nothing like this had ever happened to them before. They stared up at their empty, outstretched lassos, which a second later snapped back at them. Indigo wept, Blue cursed, Yellow stumbled, Orange cried out, "Treachery!" Violet tumbled to the grass, Red raged. But the more they thrashed about, the more tangled up they became in their own lassos, until they had snarled themselves into a grunting, groaning mass of goblins on the ground. As they lay there helplessly, a flood of colors poured forth from the flowers of the meadow. "The flowers!" screamed the blue goblin. "The flowers!" He had suddenly remembered the dangling roots he had made fun of in the cave. Through their roots, the flower had heard the goblins' plans, and they had devised a counter plan to save the rainbow. The moment the attack was launched, the flowers had drained the colors of the rainbow into their petals, and as soon as the goblins became ensnarled in their own lassos, the petals let loose the deluge. So the goblins drowned in the colors they had come to steal, and no one in the valley wept for them. The rainbow itself was reborn more magnificently than ever. Out of gratitude, it lifted up the flowers that had saved it and transformed them into glittering dragonflies and butterflies and splendidly plumed birds. But since that time, the rainbow has become more cautious. Now, when it arches across the sky, it is careful not to touch the earth anywhere. No matter how you try to sneak up on it, you can never come to the place where it begins or ends. The Rainbow Goblins was written by Ulderico, an Italian-born artist who studied in Germany. He was born during the last year of World War II. The Rainbow Goblins was published in 1978. He's also known for his work on the Never-Ending Story. The Rainbow Goblins was written during the second golden age of children's literature. As a book written during the second golden age of children's literature, most of the major themes are hid. There's a lot of fantasy in this book. The main characters are the villains, the goblins, and then the rainbow, the flowers, the animals, the sun, the moon, everybody works together to save the day. They save the world of the rainbows. It is a very dark story. It's scary, and even though good wins over bad, bad seems to have been winning a long time with rainbows until now. It's also somewhat scary. The goblins in this are not fluffy or cute, and the colors in this are very vivid. Social and political influences. This story was written post-World War II. Ulderico was born in the last year of World War II and grew up in Italy, studied art in Germany, both post-Axis countries. It was after the Civil Rights Movement in the United States. There was also a lot of anti-consumerism ideologies during this time. The world was becoming more and more capitalistic and more consumer-driven, and there were some pushback for that. It was also a time of environmentalism. We were starting to see the damages that the industry of the Industrial Revolution and all of the wars that we had was having on the world, and environmentalism was starting to come to the forefront of people's discussions. Only one place in the land had never known goblin fear, the hidden valley called the Valley of the Rainbow, where the great arches of color were born. There the animals still lived in paradise. Here we hear of a land that is untouched. Today, there is not much land that has been untouched, and that was true in the 70s as well when this book was written. I think that passages such as this throughout the book aim at teaching children about environmentalism, about treating their world kindly, and remembering that there are animals and other places. I see the goblins as a reference to humans and the way that they have sucked the life out of a lot of the earth. The Rainbow Goblins is a story of morals. It teaches the moral of environmentalism, taking care of the land, the animals, the rainbows, the water, and that all these things are connected. It also tells the moral of gluttony and how taking too much and wanting too much can end up hurting you in the end and maybe even ending your life. So 2 stories have shown that children prefer moral reasoning one stage above their own, from Hoskisson and Biskin. So what this is saying is that children like to hear stories that tell about morals that are about one stage above where their understanding is at this point. And this helps them to grow their philosophical mind. Children's literature is rich in sources of examples of moral decisions for children to discuss in a relatively safe and non-threatening environment. Hoskinson and Biskin. Again, books are a great way to tell a story using things such as goblins or animals, so they're not humans, to tell of the dangers that can happen and why morals are important for children. And it helps to pass on those social norms. Children, as any parent or teacher knows, have a steady stream of questions about why we believe what we believe. They quite naturally want to figure out the world and their place in it and have not been forced to set aside seemingly abstract ponderings for the practical demands of the real world mills. This quote really has to do with how children are sometimes seen as simple, but really they have philosophical minds and they're learning about the world around them. And that stories like this really do cut into how a child interprets the world around them and is used for them to form their opinions and interpret the world around them. And that children are capable of a lot more philosophical thinking than many of us adults are giving them credit for, and that they still have that open mind and they're not restricted like many of us as adults are on what the real world is supposed to be. The Rainbow Goblins uses a common tactic in children's stories to teach morals, and that is the use of the monster story. The goblins are scary, and they hunt, and they devour. Monster stories were traditionally told orally in forager cultures to promote survivability in young children. In the Rainbow Goblins, children are being taught about using resources respectably and not being gluttonous. Our current situation with the environment in the world shows that this is a survivability problem for our young today and was starting to be more understood in the 1970s when this story was written. We propose that MCI narratives are culturally successful partly because they enjoy a stronger cognitive advantage to recall than other narrative templates. This quote tells us about how stories that involve some things that are counterintuitive, such as goblins or the moon talking to the animals, stick in a child's mind more easily than something that is completely believable or something that is so counterintuitive that it doesn't make any sense and would never be believable. So what it's saying is you need a story that seems pretty true. There's these guys, they go for a walk, they are gluttonous, that seems true, but the plants and the animals talk to each other. That seems like maybe it isn't true. Those kinds of stories stick in children's mind more easily. So the use of the monster story, the use of minimally counterintuitive narratives helps to make the morals of this story fit in, and the morals of the story tell about the social and cultural importance of survivability of the environment.